Hey everyone, this is Bethany. I just read all that Qian wrote, but I guess it's my job to fill in the rest. After Qian sat me down and told me he was going back to the house alone, he spent a few minutes talking with his sister Jane. I used that time to go out to his car and hide in his trunk amongst his guns. He eventually came out and drove towards the house. It was around 11 a.m., and the sun was doing a pretty good job of turning the trunk into an oven. It was only when the road turned bumpy that I started to question whether or not this was a good idea. I mean, of course it was. Nick was my brother. It was my responsibility to get him back. Rocks crackled under the tires as the car rolled to a stop. I heard Qian get out and walk around to the back. He opened the trunk while staring at the house, and for a moment didn't see me. Then he looked down and let out a sigh.
Bethany, what are you doing in my trunk?
I couldn't think of a better answer than to repeat, "He's my brother."
Time is of the essence, Bethany. It would take me hours to drive you back, and at this point, we don't know how much time Nick has.
His voice was even, and I could see his frustration in the way his white knuckles gripped on the lid of the trunk. "So leave me in the car. One of my foster dads was a big hunter. I know how to shoot." Qian looked doubtful, so I picked up a .22 rifle from the trunk. "Safety, bolt, extractor, magazine," I said, pointing out the different parts of the gun, finally picking up the magazine and slipping it into the rifle. After another moment's pause, I chambered around. That satisfied him. He nodded and pulled me out of the trunk.
Listen,
he said.
I'm gonna leave you here inside my locked car. If anything comes up to you, shoot it through the window. If I hear any gunshots, I'll come straight back out. Do you understand?
"Crystal clear," I said, giving what I hoped was a reassuring smile. "What if you don't come back out?" I asked. Qian picked up a shotgun with an undermounted light.
I plan on coming back out.
He made his way up the steps, the bright sunlight gleaming in the meadow contrasting against the oppressive vibe the house gave off. I managed to wait for around 30 seconds before I couldn't stand it anymore. I slipped out of the car and followed him up the steps, the little .22 rifle slung over my back. I found Qian standing at the top of a musty set of stairs that led down to the basement. He was shining the light down into the darkness and seemed to be listening hard. Hi," I said. He jumped, nearly dropping his gun. When he saw me, his face went livid.
I can't believe... This is not the place for you, Bethany. Your parents died from these things. Why would you...
I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around him in a big hug, fighting back the heat rising in my throat. "Thank you," I said. He cut himself off mid-rant, then after a moment placed a hand on my back with a long sigh.
Don't worry about it, kid. This doesn't even begin to make up for some of the crap that I've done.
His voice was choked up. I looked in shock to see him coughing and rubbing at his eyes. "Are you getting emotional?" I asked, my voice incredulous. "I guess there's a first for everything." Qian shook his head.
Don't know what you're talking about.
He looked down at the steps, his mind back in the present.
I'm heading down there. If you follow me, you have to promise to run if I say run. Do you understand?
The smell of mildew coming from the basement made me want to vomit, but I hardened my face. "I promise." We made our way down the steps. Qian's light lit up most of our way, but the basement was a single, wide-open room. He could only illuminate a narrow cone with his light, so he constantly swept it around. I pulled out my phone and added its meager light. The entire basement looked to have water damage. Mold grew on every wall, and it was difficult to breathe with the dank mildew filling our noses. Qian swept the room, constantly checking every side. Dark holes littered the walls, holes our lights couldn't illuminate. A massive safe sat in the middle of the floor. Its door cracked open a sliver.
Bethany, take a look inside,
Qian hissed, still sweeping the room with his light. I held my light up to the opening in the safe door and saw a figure laying on the ground. A figure wearing Nick's leather jacket. "Nick!" I gasped.
"Open it,"
Qian said. I set my foot against the side of the safe and pulled at the massive metal door, swinging it open a few more inches. I slipped inside the safe and wrapped my arms around him. "Nick," I said again. He stirred, his expression confused.
"Come on, kid. We gotta get out of here,"
Qian said from the outside. Then I heard what I had been dreading. A slippery, wet voice came from somewhere in the basement.
"We told you, Master Nick. We told you you'd have your chance. To honor the old agreement, all we require is the girl, your kindred."
Nick curled up into a tighter ball, whimpering. I'd never seen him like this before. He had always known what to do, no matter the situation. When a foster dad was drunk, when we'd gotten in a car accident, I could always rely on him. His reaction scared me more than anything I'd seen up to that point. I walked out of the safe where Qian was still wildly sweeping, searching the darkness and looking for the source of the voice. A splat came from behind me. I turned around and took a picture on my phone, the flash dispelling the shadows for a split second. The creature stood before me. It looked almost nothing like it had the other night. It wore no clothes and had a dozen tentacles erupting from its body. Its face had no eyes, but his mouth seemed to have grown massively. I stood in horror. I had never seen anything so terrible in my life. It moved towards me in the darkness, but only for a moment. Qian's shotgun exploded in a hideous roar that lit the darkened basement like a hand grenade. My ears rang from the noise and eyes were stained by the flash. But Qian's undermounted light was enough to see that most of the creature's head and upper torso had been separated from its body. Qian returned to sweeping the room with his shotgun.
"Get him out of there!"
He roared. But there was no need. Nick had stepped out of the safe on his own. Nick had always been tall, but he looked deathly thin, his red hair plastered to his face with sweat. "Come on, Nick, let's go," I hissed. Then another voice from another angle. He spoke as if he were chewing too much gum.
"Good, Master Nick. Complete it. Give us our blood. This intruder will be nothing once we are fed again."
I looked closer at Nick and saw that he was holding an ornate knife in his right hand and was taking slow steps towards me. "Nick?" I asked. Qian took no notice. He was too busy sweeping the room with his light. "What are you doing?" I asked. Nick's hands were trembling and his eyes were dazed and distant. He raised the knife, then let it clatter to the floor. "I won't," he whispered. A dozen voices from all around the room erupted in screams and curses. It sounded as if a dozen men and women were being tortured all around us. Then they emerged, each corrupted with tentacles and dripping with water. Qian blasted the arm off of one, then fired wildly, missing another.
"Run!"
he shouted. I ran forward and grabbed Nick's hand, leading him up the stairs we descended. Qian went last, walking backward while blasting away at the creatures. We'd nearly reached the top of the stairs when Qian's foot caught on a loose floorboard. He fell backwards onto the step, desperately reaching to reload his shotgun. Another creature lunged at him, and he blew one of its legs off at the last minute. Then another jumped on top of him. I saw a fleshly tentacle pass through his arm, and then his chest as if it were made of steel. He fired at it and screamed.
"Go!"
Then my view was blocked as 3 more creatures leaped on top of him, their tentacles flashing down like knives in the darkness. I ran forward, but Nick wrapped his arms around my waist and wrenched me back. I fought him, but soon he carried me out of the house into his motorcycle. He threw me in front, fished the keys out of his pocket, then drove us out of there. "I can't believe we're alive," Nick kept repeating as he drove down the road. I sat in silence, too shocked to fully process what I'd seen. Then I turned to Nick and told him to drive towards Jane's place. Jane didn't seem too shocked at the news. Apparently Qian had filled her in before leaving. She gave me a long hug before I left and handed me a letter. "He said to give this to you if he didn't come back," she said. I'm not going to tell you what was inside. That's for me alone. I'll tell you this, though. I've decided what I'm going to school for. Criminal justice. I'm going to be a private investigator.